Hey everyone, welcome to my first recap of the Gibraltar Battle of the Sexes. This was game one. I'm playing against Marsel Efroimski from Israel, international master, rated 2437. And coming into this game, I knew she was going to play e4. This is her main move. Found a few hundred of her previous tournament games in the database. And I had a decision to make, more decision last night for me, what opening to choose. Um, I'm glad I didn't play Stafford. I asked her after the game if she had prepared against it, and she told me that her friends were telling her that I play a lot of Stafford Gambit on stream and to be prepared for it. So I decided to play Sicilian. Just another playable opening, a bit more legitimate compared to the Stafford. And after knight f3, I usually play e6 or knight c6, but I decided to play a move I've never played before in at least in a classical tournament, is move pawn d6. Now d6, it's it can lead to a lot of different things, and I don't want to reveal what I was specifically preparing against d4, which she didn't play. She played an anti-Sicilian bishop to b5 check, which is very trendy these days. If she did play d4, we would have had a more maybe interesting opening battle. But opening battle turned out to be quite interesting as well, because we went into some of my main preparation. This is very common way of playing. White is going for a Marazzi bind structure with eventual knight c3 and d4. Has a very solid reputation. I played this myself as white. It's a type of opening you can play, and it's hard to go too wrong. Now, I had looked at this last night and this morning, so I was prepared for the next several moves after knight f6, knight c3, g6, going for somewhat of a dragon setup. d4 takes, bishop g7, castling, and here my opponent played pawn to h3. Now, a few things to say about the opening so far. First of all, at a very high level, white castling in this position is considered slightly dubious as far as I know. If white wants to play for more of an advantage, it's more proper to play f3 first, preparing bishop to e3, and of course preventing knight g4. After castling, bishop e3. I don't know if I want to get into all the nuances, but the gist of it is that white should play in this way because after rook c8, b3, I don't have any immediate way to really target the center. As we're going to see in the game, after castling, white has to find a way to complete development here. Bishop e3 still runs into knight g4. And the inclusion of white castling actually slows white down a little bit. As we see in the game f3, I play rook c8, and white doesn't have time for bishop e3 because the pawn is attacked. Opponent played b3. And this allowed a really cool move, which I'll admit I was out of preparation at this point, but I still knew kind of the general ideas. And it's very typical for black to try and tear down white's kind of central solid formation. And the main pawn breaks are either d5 or b5. And neither move looks playable here, but I went ahead and played b5 after a bit of a think. And we'll get into the tactics of this move. But I do want to share another tidbit of preparation because I think it is interesting just to see what could have happened. If white played f3 here, then I would still play rook c8. And after b3, this is a position that's been reached over 100 times in master level play. And there's a very cool move for black to play pawn d5, which just looks impossible when you first glance at it. White has a lot of things attacking d5. But this move is known just to equalize completely. And I'm looking at the stats here. After the main move, e takes d5, about 90% of the games end in draws from this position. And the point for black is that after knight takes d5, it's a temporary piece sacrifice. Of course, if white takes with the pawn, we take the knight. And if knight takes d5, there is a nice move e6. And black is winning back the piece. One of these knights are going to be lost. And it's completely fine position for black. And it's actually white who has to play accurately to equalize here. Bishop h6 is the main line. And I was prepared a few moves further from here. But this didn't happen in the game. But hopefully it gives some background into the type of position I was anticipating. So after h3, rook c8, b3, and b5, I was feeling pretty good. This is exactly what I was kind of hoping for out of the opening, is to get a position on my terms where I'm the one kind of generating initiative from early on. And to explain b5, even though white can take potentially 3 different ways, it's a little bit awkward. First of all, the pawn can't take because then I just win the knight. If knight c takes b5, then I would win this pawn, and this would just be a beneficial trade for me. There was a line queen f3, but then d5, and I think black is doing quite well here. If the other knight takes b5, then there's tactics along the diagonal, and I can take on e4. So the main point of this whole b5 break is to trade a flank pawn for a center pawn. And I essentially forced that to happen. And my opponent played an interesting move, pawn e5, which I think is one of the better ways to handle the position, because of course white doesn't want to allow me to take on c4. So e5 was a way to give away the e-pawn, force me to double my pawns, and then take on b5. The position transforms into a very imbalanced situation, where after a6, knight moves back, and then knight c6. White has kind of the queenside majority. I have the kingside majority, but this pawn on e5 is a little bit awkward. However, I thought I was doing quite well here, given that I just have better pieces. The knight on a3 is going to have a hard time coming back into the game. There's still some x-ray vision along the diagonal. And if we trade queens, I'd be very happy to take with the knight, eventually go for e4, f5, knight c5, and I thought this would be a nice kind of queenless middle game to play from the black side. So my opponent here played bishop to e3, waiting for me to trade queens, after which white would just take over the d-file. So I decided to avoid the queen trade with queen f5, essentially just improving my queen and also preparing rook d8. And I realized here that white's queen doesn't have a clear great square to go to. For example, of course, rook d8 is coming. If the queen goes to e2, then I'll have knight d4 to hit it. And if the queen goes to c2, which happened in the game, then I have this move knight to b4. And I was feeling quite good, just given that I hit the queen. I essentially forced white to trade queens on f5, which makes my pawn structure a bit funny. Now I have adjacent double pawns. I don't know what we call this. If the pawns were a bit further advanced, I would call it the pawn cube, but this is more a pawn rectangle type thing. And I know double pawns have the reputation of sometimes being weak, but I think these are very strong double pawns because they're not easily attackable, and I can very possibly just advance and gain more space with either f4 or e4 in the near future. So here my opponent played knight to a4, which was, I think, called for, given that there's some kind of weak squares on the queen side. White now has a threat of knight b6, but also the threat of bishop to c5, now that knight supports c5, and that would hit my knight and the e7 pawn. So at first I was thinking of just playing rook b8, which looks like the most natural move, and this is probably what I should have done. Although the move I played I was still content with is rook to c7. The point of this move is I keep the c7 pawn defended, and in the event of bishop c5, only my knight is attacked, and here I can play knight d3 with tempo. So I thought rook c7 was a bit more useful, though this did allow white to play bishop to b6, which happened. had to move the rook, and then bishop to a5 was played. And we got kind of a weird setup on the a-file. A-file is almost completely occupied. If only I could play rook a7, although that would be a bit blunderous. But with bishop a5, it's very logical for white to try and remove my knight, because the knight on b4 has done a great job so far of restricting this knight from moving to c2. So I didn't want to allow the trade, because if I give white the chance to take, then after takes, knight c2, white's knight can come back in the game, and it would be a bit easier to play. So I decided to retreat, but also attack the bishop. Bishop moved to c3, and I kept initiative here with knight e4, hitting the bishop, and also unleashing my bishop, so now it supports the pawn. And if white isn't careful here and plays a move like knight c2, then tactics are just on my side. I can take and play e4, and white is already losing material, given the biche is unleashed. The biche is unleashed. The beast is unleashed on g7. I would win at least exchange here. So that didn't happen. Opponent played bishop to b2. I control the d-file, and I'm gearing up for either the double up or the invasion with rook d2. So f3 was played, hitting the knight. And it is a question what my knight should be doing in this position. However, the drawback of f3 is it does weaken the g3 square. So I went in, knight g3, hitting the rook. And here my opponent delivered a counterattack. Rather than moving the rook, hit my rook. And now the position gets really confusing. And I spent a lot of time here trying to figure out what was going on, because there's a lot of different options, and I was a bit perplexed. There's a lot of candidate moves for black. I could take the rook, I could move my own rook, I could go in with rook d2 potentially. There's knight e2 check. So sometimes positions like this, it can be fun to kind of investigate the various options, but it also can be very time consuming and energy consuming. And after a long think, I didn't have any like definite conclusions of what my approach should be. And I decided to play a move which I thought just keeps the game going, rook to c7, just hitting or aligning with the knight and keeping initiative against white's rook on f1. After the game, my opponent told me that she was more scared of knight e2 check, king f2, and then rook d2. Which I'll admit I didn't really look at so closely, but this looks like a fascinating position, given that I just leave my rook hanging on b7, and I go for the instant counterattack against white's second rank. And I'm very, very tempted to turn on the engine here. Maybe I will. Let's see. What does Stockfish say? Wow, Stockfish says black is better, but it's not clearly winning. It's minus 0.8 after knight takes b7, and then only move to keep advantage, knight f4 check, king to g1, I take on g2, king h1, rook takes b2. Black is down the exchange, but has a very good play for being down the exchange. So maybe if I calculated further, I would have at least considered that more, but that didn't happen. I played rook to c7. Now I'm just remembering there was a line I calculated during the game, which I do want to show because it was such a beautiful line. And I thought there was a small chance my opponent might stumble into it. But the line was actually going back to, what was it? Going back to the position after rook to e8. I had calculated until mate in this position. So after f3, knight g3, the calculation was rook d1, and the variation was rook d7, takes, king h2, f4, knight c5, rook to d2, and after bishop to c3, rook e2, knight takes a6. This seems maybe like a random line to calculate, but I thought the line flowed very nicely. And here there's a beautiful shot for black to play the move pawn e4, just unleashing the bishop, also creating threats against the king side. And after bishop takes g7, during the game, I only looked at king takes g7, realizing e takes f3 is also winning here. But the line goes king g7, pawn takes pawn, and then knight to e5, with essentially the unstoppable threat of knight f3. This is a maiden one threat, really beautiful maiden one, and this was my fantasy during the game. I'm realizing now that white does have the move h4, but Stockfish is spitting out forced mate after knight g4, king to h3, and f5, and white doesn't have a good defense against this, and the king is just completely stuck. So that would have been a really funny line and fun line for me. But let's go back to the game. Apologies for the long tangent, but it's a nice thing about like classical slow chess is I do have time to calculate these very deep and beautiful lines when the position allows for it. So knight c5 was played. I play rook c7 and rook f2 d1, challenging the d file. And now the issue for me is that I can't play rook d7 and take over the d file because the knight controls d7. So I have to find another move. And I played the move knight d4, thinking that, okay, why not just improve the pieces, improve the knight, unleash the rook, and create more tactical opportunities, especially on the king side with knight e2 check ideas. Now, when I play this move, I am sacrificing the a6 pawn. So essentially, I'm going all in. I'm giving away the pawn with the hope that the king side initiative will work out in my favor. And my opponent took the pawn, which I wasn't surprised about. I was expecting, because it's still not entirely clear how black should continue the attack, even though it looks pleasant for black. The knight, actually both knights are sidelined, and I have time here to try and generate something. The move I really wanted to play during the game was rook to c6, to swing the rook over to g6. I thought this would be a really nice maneuver. But I didn't end up playing this because white has a move knight b4, and after rook g6, I didn't quite see what to do against knight to d5. Now I'm realizing, do have the engine turned on here. Engine's giving +2 for white, so apparently black has no attack. Even though it looks scary, engine's giving knight b5, and looks like white can probably force some trades with the pin along the d file. So probably good that I didn't go for that. And instead, after knight d4, knight a6, I played the move rook a7, just trying to keep initiative, hit the knight on a6. And here my opponent played knight to b4. I'll admit that I made a very simple oversight. First of all, I was expecting the move knight c5, which I thought would allow rook a8, and then I'll win back the a2 pawn, or win 2 pieces for the rook, 2 minor pieces for the rook. But the oversight I made is that after knight b4, the knight defends a2, and I don't have the same move to win the a pawn. And essentially here I'm down a pawn, and I have to figure out some way to get initiative, and came up with a move rook a to d7, which now doubles on the d file, has a very clear threat of knight e2 or knight takes f3 to discovered attack, win the rook on d1. So my opponent played king to f2, hitting my knight. I defended with f4, and now bishop takes d4 was played. And here I thought, like in the moment, I thought this was a mistake, because after takes, I'm essentially taking over the d file. I thought I'm guaranteed to either get rook d2 or just get a crushing initiative with eventually e4, unleash the bishop, while white's pieces are really misplaced on the queen side. It turns out here that I completely misevaluated the situation, and white has a very precise line to basically kill all my counterplay. After rook takes d4, I played rook takes d4, and here it is white to move and find the only move which doesn't lose. And maybe I'll pose this as an exercise to viewers. I should do this more often when there's cool tactics or cool moments. Yeah, try and find the best move. Feel free to pause the video. I'll go ahead and say, if white plays this move, it's completely winning for white. If white doesn't play this move, it's completely losing for white. So the only move, and it's a prophylactic move, is to prevent rook d2 with the move king to e1. And I saw this during the game, and I was still feeling good because I have the move pawn e4, which I did eventually play. And this move unleashes a bishop. So there's a situation if takes, and I just win the rook because the king's in check. Because white can't take, I was looking forward to getting pawn on e3. The problem is white plays the move rook to d1, and unfortunately, I just run into a complete wall. White has a very, very solid blockade. After rook takes d1, king takes d1. If I go ahead and play e3, it's really, really close to winning because the threat is e2 and bishop c3, and then score the touchdown on e1. So if white wastes a move with h4 just to show e2, king d2, bishop c3, I'm guaranteeing to queen. The problem with this line is white has a simple move, knight to b5. And there's no bishop c3, and there's no way to make progress here. Even if I get a pawn to e2, I can't effectively use my bishop to attack the king on e1 because the c3 square is controlled, and if I go and try and access this diagonal, in order to attack the king, I would have to move my knights, and when I move my knight, I would lose a pawn. So there's nothing to do here for black, and the a-pawn's ready to run, or the c-pawn's ready to run. So I spent pretty much the remainder of my time. I went from like 7 minutes, I thought all the way down to below a minute here, and realized that I'm in big trouble because we have to trade rooks. There's no other option for me to avoid a trade. I was hoping for a line like takes, and if rook takes, then there's maybe some hope with after takes. I would have some check threat, and I'm also threatening this, but of course white can just take back. And again, there's not much for me, and white has 3 connected pawns on the queen side. So after most of my time evaporated, I decided to take on d1, king takes d1, and I played pawn f5. Realizing that e3 didn't really do much for me, I wanted to leave some tension in the position. I also had the idea of getting a pawn cube with pawn e5. And not just for the lulz, but pawn e5 would maybe have some idea of taking, and then eventually playing pawn to e4 yet again. But this was basically just desperation at this point. Opponent played knight to d5, and here I really wanted to play e5, but I didn't because white just queens the c-pawn. If I allow pawn c5, my king is just not in time. Actually, it is in time. After king f7, here, I do control c8. The problem is knight c4, and there's no stopping knight b6 and c8 queen. So I realized that with about 15 seconds left, and instead of playing pawn e5, I played bishop e5, trying to at least control the diagonal and stop white's future pawns. But here my opponent played knight takes e7, losing the e-pawn, king f7, knight goes back to d5, I play king e6, and I will note that the time control we started with 90 minutes, there was a 30-second increment, and on move 40, we would each get an extra half hour. We're on move 36 right now, so I needed to make four more moves until I got the extra half hour, but I was just living on the increment. And after knight to b5, king d7, played this move with 2 seconds left, knight c3, I let my time tick all the way down to 1 second. And then I realized I had 1 second in this position and then tried to blitz out the move e3, but I was a little bit too slow and I flagged and it was game over. White won. Now I wasn't too upset because the position is just completely losing. I'm already down, what, 2 pawns, and there's just no way to make progress on the king side. Even though the pawns look pretty, what to do. If I do play e3, then white can very simply play knight to e2. Now f4 is attacked. If I move here, then I'm basically just tied down to f4, and white is ready to start pushing the queenside pawns. So my opponent actually played really well from what seemed to be a difficult middle game position, kept chances alive, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to find the right moves in the critical moments. I'm going to have to analyze this game a bit deeper with Engine because I'm not exactly sure what my losing mistake was. But it could have been, like in this moment with the knight counterattack, this was probably my biggest opportunity to play knight e2 and go for rook d2 and go for the exchange sacrifice. So it's sometimes moments like this that can make or break you. But overall, I'm not too upset. I will say it was really refreshing to play like an OTB classical game. Nice to move physical pieces rather than just playing online. And yeah, there's still 9 more games to go. It wasn't the best day for the men's team. If I just show real quick. So here are the standings from the first day. As we see, the women had the white pieces, and we see some more wins for white. The overall score is, what is it? For 6.5 to 3.5? Yeah, 6.5, 3.5 to the women. Hopefully my math is right. It's been a long day for me. But yeah, first round, still 9 games to go. Tomorrow I will be playing well-known player and commentator Jovanka Hauska from England. So that should be a fun one. I'll have the white pieces. So I do encourage people to follow not just my games, but the whole event in general. It's a really cool format. I'll leave links below to the official website, the chess results page for pairings and standings, the official broadcast on the gibchess YouTube channel, and stay tuned for more content.